secretly against terrorism in their own countries and directed at the West. And on the other hand, they want to be, quote, on the right side of the street, the Arab street. That is, they want to identify with the causes that Osama bin Laden and people like him attempt to tap into.
So when you hear Pakistan, for instance, say, we're on your side, we utterly condemn this, we will help you, ought we to take that with a grain of salt?
I think we ought to be hopeful that they mean what they say, but once again, having worked there, Pakistan is a country whose secular government, they are even embarrassed about calling themselves that, but this is a government that is deeply torn. It is very full of factions and sympathizers with the Islamists. Their intelligence service is penetrated. It's going to be very hard for them to pull this off.
All right, let me turn that as a Chaffetz, and I want to start with a specific subject about which you wrote, and that has to do with the issue of airline security in the United States. We've heard it probably 1,000 times said that, you know, that we now have to become, every American airline has to become El Al, which hasn't had a hijacking in 30 years. They rigorously search bags, they do interviews. Can we do that?
No, I don't think so.
Why not?
First of all, Israel has only one airport, has only one international airport, only one airline, only several airlines traveling in and out. America has thousands of airports. And besides that, El Al security is not a matter of technique, it's a matter of philosophy. It takes into account that there are potentially dangerous people getting on planes. And it treats people, passengers, as potential suspects. Or as potential dangers, security dangers.
Well, I don't see, yes.
That will,
we could do that.
At best, that will take hours and hours of preparatory time for flights. It will slow down the American economy. But beyond that, it's not really the issue, because America is a country with tens of thousands of targets. If terrorists find that, if there were security at airports, I mean real security, which would cost a fortune and which would take an enormous amount of effort, but if that were to happen, terrorists would go to the train station. They'd go to the nearest high school. They'd go to the ball game.
It does raise this issue of locking the barn door after the horse is gone. That is, I've seen all these stories of incredibly tightened security at American airports, curbside check-ins and the like. And I have to admit, I thought to myself, yeah, but it's not likely that the next terrorist will do what the last one.
Of course not. There, you know, right now there are buildings all over Manhattan and all over the East Coast and all over the country that are wide open. After the World Trade Center, there's no security in genuine terms.
So you're talking
here.
about somebody walking into Penn Station, which obviously has no
Or Grand
security.
Central, or any place. And you know, the issue is that you can't deal with terrorism. There are probably tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, Arabs, Muslims, who are prepared to carry out terrorist acts in this country. You can't deal with terrorism by picking them off one at a time. It's an impossibility.
And so instead?
You have to go to the source.
And the source is?
The source, first of all, are the countries that support terrorism, and they are Syria, Iran, and Iraq, and probably Iran and Iraq most importantly, and maybe Syria, because they have the potential to have nuclear weapons.
Zev, when you say we must go to them, what do you mean?
I mean that it's December 8th, 1941, and people are saying, what should we do about Japan? There are 100 million Japanese, there are 100 million Germans. How can we ever conquer these countries? It's impractical. We should fire a missile. We should go after the commander of the Japanese Navy. That's nonsense. America is going to have to go in, dismantle and disarm these insane governments, and the terrorists that they support, or the next attack on this city, or the one after, ask Judy, will be a biological or a nuclear attack, and it won't be 5,000 dead, it will be 500,000 dead.
Mr. Bremer, I think what Mr. Chaffetz is saying, in fact I'm pretty sure of it, is we have to declare war on the states of Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Is that what we have to do?
Well, I hope not. As I said, I think the inner circle of the focus is going to be on Afghanistan, where I think we will be at war. I think there is something, however, he has said that's very true, which is 20 years ago, the United States government took the lead in developing an international consensus that the use and support of terrorism was no longer acceptable, and we did a pretty good job of building that consensus during the 80s. That has largely been lost during the 90s. And we've got to rebuild that consensus now. We've got to get serious about it when we say that we consider, for example, the countries he named, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. When we say they're terrorist-supporting states, then our policy has to follow that through to the consequences, and we have to insist that our allies agree. For example, our allies have been falling all over themselves to sign commercial agreements with Iran. In fact, we have also got the possibility of putting sanctions on those countries which have been waived by the previous administration and by this administration. Syria has the headquarters of a dozen terrorist groups, known terrorist groups who operate in the open in Damascus, terrorist groups which have killed Israeli and other citizens in just this past year. They operate freely in Damascus. Syria allows more than a dozen terrorist training camps to continue to operate in the Bekaa Valley, though it has been raised with them for more than 15 years. Those kinds of things have simply got to be stopped. And in the end, if they don't stop them, we may have to take military action. But it seems to me that's not the immediate concern now. The immediate concern now is to take some steps that show that we are really serious about terrorism, to take steps which broaden that beyond the immediate targets of Afghanistan and bin Laden, and to create this new international consensus.
Judy Miller, pick up on something that Zev alluded to, that the next time it's not going to be 5,000, but God knows how many. You've just co-authored a book on germ warfare. Do you take, and there was a report, I should mention, in an Arab newspaper just yesterday that Osama bin Laden had trumpeted the fact that he says thousands of young supporters of his have studied chemical, biological, nuclear warfare, prepared to martyr themselves for it. Without getting into the assessment of that, do you take seriously the fact that we, the United States, are under potential threat for an attack in the chemical or biological field? Well,
if I didn't take that threat seriously, I wouldn't have written this book. I think that I started out, Jeff, very, very skeptically. I did not believe that biological weapons were a real threat to this country. I thought that all the people issuing these warnings were kind of looking for a new enemy. And the more I looked at the spread of this very dangerous technology and how relatively easy this was to do compared to the enormous expense and difficulty of a nuclear infrastructure that you need to make a weapon, the more of a no-brainer it seemed. And my colleagues and I concluded that this really was the 21st century weapon for what President Bush has called the 21st century wars.
Well, okay. When I stood on the roof here at CNN, 2 miles north of the World Trade Center with my colleague Aaron Brown, and looked at the smoke billowing across lower Manhattan, I will confess to you that one of my thoughts was, suppose they brought something with them on those planes. If that is the case, then is it too alarmist to say we may have to go in and declare war on every state that is harboring groups that have the potential and the willingness to use germ warfare against the West?
Well, you know, I think there are a lot of steps short of that the administration is going to start to take. But the first thing they can really do is make good on the previous administration's promise to, quote, drain the swamp. I mean, that was Mike Sheehan's great pledge. He was the former director of counterterrorism for the State Department, and he said what you have to do to get rid of these networks is drain the swamp in which they live. And under the Clinton administration, I have to say that some progress was made in eliminating the countries that play host to these groups. And now we have to concentrate on the rest of them.
Before I turn to the last question and get a comment from each of you, I want, Zev, for you to take us a little more personally into this issue. You lived in Israel for 30 years. It's a state that has never lived outside of conflict and threat. Do you get used to it? I mean, do you go out at night and put that thought behind you, or is it always with you?
You get used to it, but in the Israeli reality, you mentioned that I lived in Israel for 30 years. I served in the Army for close to 30 years, in the active Army and the reserve. So does everyone. We learn to be careful, and we learn that we have to be proactive. One of the things that is very hard for Americans to do is to stare evil in the face. And if you want to combat evil, if you want to fight Islamic and Arab terrorism, and I don't call them generically terrorism because we're talking about Islamic and Arab terrorism, you have to call them by their proper name, you have to put your finger on where they are, you have to go after them, and you have to finish the job.
you've also were born in America and live here now. This is a country that is almost in this sense the mirror image of Israel, right, Judy? We've never lived with anything approaching threat, not even in World War II. Can a country like ours learn?
I can tell you that if we don't learn in this country, if America doesn't learn, there will be disastrous consequences. And I don't think America needs to learn. The governments, the armies of Iran and Iraq and Syria are not so formidable. Israel is a 5 million person state, and it's been fighting these morons successfully for 30, 40, 50 years.
But so you still have suicide bombers, and you have
Sure.
more of them every day.
That's right.
So,
And,
how
and
is that a victory?
It's the victory. First of all, the victory is that Israel is there, and it's getting bigger and stronger and richer and more free as time goes on. But the point is that we have to deal with reality, and now reality has showed up in Manhattan. The reality of the Arab and Islamic Middle East is here. You are, as we are, the enemy of these people, and they will do here what they've done in Israel. They will try to kill as many people as possible, and they will do it very efficiently.
Let me turn to the. But before I turn to you, Mr. Bremer, I just want to get from Judith Miller a reaction to that. Chaffetz says the only solution is to go in and dismantle these states.
I don't think that's possible. I mean, my own view, I don't think that it may be necessary. I think these states want ultimately not to be isolated. And if the rest of the world means what it says about joining America in this campaign, I think they will find themselves truly isolated, and that hopefully the use of military force will not be necessary. But, Jeff, I want to say one more thing. I think it's very dangerous. We're on a very slippery slope here. The terrorists win if we become the enemy that we are fighting. If we live in fear, if we do violent things that kill innocent people, we become them, and they will gloat at this victory. So it's very difficult to fight on one hand and maintain our democratic values on the other.
Mr. Bremer, I want to bring you in and ask what I suppose is in one sense, the toughest question. How will we know when we've won? We knew how we won in Japan. They surrendered on a aircraft carrier. I remember, seeing those pictures in history. How will we know when we've won this war?
Well, first of all, fighting terrorism is more like fighting crime. Terrorism has been here since recorded history began, and it's always going to be here. So there is no final victory in the sense that terrorism is stamped out any more than you can stamp out crime. A legitimate goal for foreign policy is to get terrorism down to a point where it does not dominate our foreign policy, where we conduct our relations with other nations on other bases of political and diplomatic interchange, economic interchange, free trade, and so forth. But we need to be a bit realistic. We're not going to eliminate terrorism. It's always going to be there. There always will be vulnerabilities. And as Judy Miller said, the real challenge for a country like America, the great strength of America, is an ability to wage this kind of a war while protecting our civil liberties that we have fought and died for over 200 years, and to keep those in balance with the measures we're now going to have to take, security measures we're now going to have to take. I think we can do that. We've done it before. We are a great and resilient nation, and we will come through this.
But let me just pursue this analogy, false though it may be. When we defeated Japan and Germany, we killed countless hundreds of thousands of their civilians as well as military people. We occupied their capitals. And within a relatively short amount of time, Germany and Japan became functioning, healthy democracies allied with the West. There's no chance. Is there any chance that that could possibly happen with states like Iran, Iraq, and Syria? I mean, even if it were militarily possible?
Well, first, I don't think you can generalize. I think Iran is already a democracy. They have elections there. You can't say the same thing about Iraq, and Syria has basically phony elections. So you've got to look at each of them individually in terms of their culture and their history and their background. I'm not advocating, I share Judy's concern. I'm not advocating that we go to war with everybody who's in the neighborhood. I think if we act vigorously in the narrow case of Afghanistan and the Taliban and Osama bin Laden, we will find that we can change the whole dynamic of the region, where people will begin to respect that we are really serious, we really mean business, and if we can get our allies to stand with us, we'll find that we can get a lot of things done without having to use force in the second ring, that is, that